Hello, everyone, and welcome to our anti-racism learning anniversary. And we just want to say thanks to our wonderful members on anti-racism and its intersectionality with the intercultural field. We just want to say again, thanks to our special guest speakers from Africa to India, crossing Bristol, London, and Australia.
I will now introduce, and again, please forgive me, Katharina, but Dr. Katharina Lefringhansen, who is an assistant professor at the University of Warwick, where she continues her research on majority members' globalization-based proximal acculturation. That is their degree to which they maintain their national culture and or adopt to minority members' cultures. She's currently the director, community development director for SIETAR UK, and leads the Refugee and Asylum Seeker Project. So thank you for being here today. And I was reading about your work and I'm very excited to hear about it. I think it probably, it is a full mouthful to say tridimensional proximal acculturation, but you probably know that better than anyone else. So can you share with us your work and how it fits into this big picture of today's conversation around how people, majority members process their experience and why power matters?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this very lovely welcome, and I'm absolutely honored to be part of this panel. And I hope you can see this PowerPoint slide.
Yes.
Yes, I see you nodding. Fantastic. So yes, a long name, but you can see my name already is very long, and it's actually going to become longer because I will marry next year and it will be double-barreled. So, I'm just a fan of long names. So there you go. But in sum, it's literally exactly about what you just said. It's about focusing on how do cultural majority members, and what this is I'm going to talk about in a second, change towards cultural minority members, and in the future, what is the role of power? How do we need to address that further? And I just want to give a quick shout to my main collaborators who have been with me for a long time on this journey, Dr. Tara Marshall, Professor Jonas Kunst, and Dr. Nelly Ferenczi. So you might have heard this statement yourself. This is actually a quote from a mixed method study that has been published last year from a Finnish national, or native if you want so. They were asked, well, would you change towards immigrants' cultures? And the answer is, well, as a native person, why should I adapt my principles to the ones of an immigrant? I think maybe it should be the opposite. That they should adapt their views and behavior because they are the ones to come here to the strange culture in the end. So clear proposition, you come here, so you need to change to my rules, to how things work here. And this has not only been the main discourse and position within the public debate and from a lot of politicians, but also within science. So when we look back in psychology research, we started to investigate how do people who move to other cultures might experience change. What happens to them on a behavior level, value level, with regard to their identities, and of course, all the consequences it might have. Yeah, whether people are more inclined towards lower psychological well-being, how well they fit into the new workplace, school environments, and so forth. So they all came in the theory of acculturation, which suggests that, again, this change might happen because people are in contact with another culture. And the linkage of this theory, however, was mainly focused on minority members. And with minority members, we mean those who are not dominant, who don't have the power in a certain society. So people who move from one country to another. Yeah, they have less representation, they have less, usually, societal status, they have less support from the institution. Maybe they don't have the right to vote, for example. Then came John Berrien, and he proposed a bidimensional acculturation model. So before then, someone like me, I'm a German migrant living in the UK, I had only the choice, according to psychological research, to either completely immerse myself in the British culture, so I assimilate, or I completely reject the British culture and I stick to my German root. I only speak German and I stick to my German norms and behaviors and values. John Barry, however, and after him a lot of research has happened, showed that this is nonsense and the process is at least bidimensional. So me as a German migrant, I have the option to integrate. And I know this term is floating around quite a lot, and it's so important to really understand what do we mean with integration. Integration is not assimilation, which so often is being used synonymously, especially by politicians. Integration means me as a German migrant, I can maintain elements of my Germanness. I can still speak German. I'm not going to be like, going to reject this. I can still feel German. I can still have context to German friends, German members. At the same time, however, I can feel belonging to the UK. I can speak English. I can adapt values, norms, ways of behaviors that are more common within a British context. And that is integration. Now, Barry actually also proposed a third dimension because, of course, again, thinking about this power dynamic, when you're a migrant or, for instance, a refugee or an international student, to what extent you can integrate really strongly depends on whether the host society lets you. If they say no, you can't do anything about it. You can adapt as well as you want. You can speak the language fluently. If they say you're not part of the community, there's no way for you to get there. So this power dimension was introduced to think about, oh, what is the role of majority members? So majority members like host country nationals. So talking about the UK, this would be white English nationals, being the dominant cultural group in the sense that their culture, their behavior, their values are being seen as the one that represents the UK or the British culture. So from this notion of power of the majority member or the gatekeeper role over minorities, then concepts like acculturation expectation emerged. So a lot of research went into, well, what does an English majority member expect an immigrant to do? Do they expect them to assimilate or to integrate? And where does this lead to? Does this lead to more conflict between the groups or to harmony? What can we learn about that? Then there was another strand of research that said, well, we need to look more into how do people support policies or how a society should manage cultural diversity. This is understood as intergroup ideologies. And now this is also being conceptualized as norms. And again, the idea as well, how does a majority member think how society should manage with policies or initiatives, cultural diversity, and therefore the integration or not of minority members. Then a lot more recently, however, we finally started to realize, hold on, there's something called globalization. There is movement of people. There are products that we engage with or use. And they also might have an impact on us. So then concepts like remote acculturation emerged, which is about, there's a lot of research, especially on Jamaican youth on this, how they adapt to American culture. So a geographically distant culture because of the media they consume. Yeah, I remember being in Germany as a teenager and we talked about being Americanized because we all watched the A-Team and Knight Rider. And I was walking around in a t-shirt with the American flag on it. Now, going back, however, to the statement at the beginning, well, as a native person, therefore, why should I adapt? Well, so we talked about at the moment, not much really has been done on this. Well, why should you adapt? Is adaptation actually happening for majority member, like a white English national, towards minorities in the own society? Well, first of all, why they should do this is, if you support an egalitarian society, if this is something you would aim for, then yes, you should make the effort to change. And as a second part, it is simply more functional. This is just an example of people who were born outside of the UK. Of course, there's a lot more data on ethnic minorities, however you might define them. But just to show that we are mixing, we are moving, and this is happening more and more. And if you want to do well and fit and feel comfortable in such an environment, you need to adapt. That is how life works. So therefore, we introduced the concept of the long name globalization-based, because it is people moving in rather than you moving away. Proximal acculturation, because it's two cultures that are in a shared society. So the main part of this is really to understand that it's a change towards minority cultures that we often say have lower ethno-linguistic vitality, so lower status, demographic strengths, or institutional support. And this obviously challenges the embeddedness of majority members in their more powerful or privileged group, if they might change to this other minority culture or towards the minority cultures. To say it more specifically, so that there's no misunderstanding, that I'm not talking about eating more curry or watching or attending more Holy One festivals. It's about the recognition of minority groups' culture, not just that. It is the involvement of the genuine incorporation of aspects of minority group culture into majority group members' default cultural repertoire. And that ultimately, if this is happening, will lead to changes in the mainstream culture at societal level. So we really talk about deep-rooted change. And if you now think, oh, you know, that's a lot of bollocks and I've never seen this happening, that's fair enough. You're not the only one who thinks this way, but there is some evidence and I want to show it to you. So these are about 14 independent samples across 6 national groups. As you can see, are nicely listed. This is in a recent summary published. There's the preprint on the left side that you can enter, where we actually have found classic acculturation strategy groups amongst majority members changing towards minority members in a shared society. So we have people from the US, from India, from China. We have people from a workplace versus just the general public. We have people from Germany and Finland, and Norway down here from Hagen and Kunst. And we found people who are integrated. So you can see this with the color scheme. We found people, of course, who are separated to say, I ain't changing and I stick to my national culture. Maybe also they might have not as much contact with other cultures in a shared society. But what does this mean? What does this imply? Does this mean, oh my God, I'm losing something? Is this going to impact me negatively in any way? Well, we have some knowledge of what this means. All of these studies, however, are correlational. I just want to stress this. So there's no cause and effect relationship that I'm presenting here. However, I'm working on this right now, soon to be published, hopefully. So one thing I want to draw attention to is down here with regard to perceived threat. So this is something like we ask majority members, well, do you feel threatened by other cultures? And you can imagine that this has negative consequences. When you walk around and you think that your culture, your nation, your neighborhood is invaded by someone you don't want to have there, you don't feel really happy. You're not really comfortable, say that way. But as you can see, those people who are adopted to other cultures report they have no issues with this. And they have a lot lower levels in this element of perceived threat. Whereas on the reverse side, we can see that those who are adopted have more positive feelings towards immigrants. They also have more intercultural sensitivity. So this was measured in terms of lower ethnocentrism and more ethno-relativism. And they perceive other cultures in a shared society as enrichment. So that is quite promising. Also, I just want to point out, we don't really understand that maintaining your national culture is automatically something negative. We're not saying, or the data doesn't show, oh, get rid of everything that you're familiar with. Yes, if you are maintaining your national culture, you might feel more threatened. You might even perceive that you're being discriminated against because of your national culture. However, you have to remember this was measured in 2 dimensions, and people endorse both, or they can endorse both. Yeah? So people who are integrated don't have this profile, and there's actually some data on this as well. So when you're integrated, you don't perceive threat. And at the same time, you can see here that sometimes the relationship is not significant, which then leads me more to, well, a national culture is quite complicated. And we can think about it, if we want to split it more simplistically, at least into civic understanding or an ethnic understanding. So do we think national culture is something that we can gain, you can learn, you can become part of, or do we think you're born into it? That already will make a massive difference whether you think your culture is threatened or not. But what about equal relationships? a majority member might say, oh, your culture is so exotic and fantastic, I want to learn everything about it, or you already probably cringed at the term is exotic. And that's exactly what I'm hinting at with equal, because there's one thing about just taking culture from other people, and then there's another thing of meeting them on equal terms. So there's some fantastic qualitative research by Dr. Justin Dandy in Australia, who looked at Anglo-Australians and their acculturation orientations towards refugees, Indigenous Australians, and immigrants who went to Australia. And just to show you some quotes that look into this aspect of power, of meeting on equal terms or not, is, so she has some answers from discussing this part with majority members on acculturation. And she points out that the language is very interesting that you hear when they talk. They often use we and our versus their and others to refer to refugees or minority Australians. H 2000 argues that the assigning labels of other or them to an outgroup gives majority members feelings of empowerment and supervisorship over the Australian space, while rendering members of the outgroup as objects to be managed. So this participant's feeling that practices in our society, our country, should not be changed to accommodate others is an example of majority members supervising the Australian space and setting the terms by which this space operates. And there's another nice quote where, when it's about asking, well, would you be still willing to change? The answer is, well, the majority of Australians regarded learning about non-Indigenous minority cultures as important because it would increase understanding and empathy. Okay, so there seems to be some understanding for the need, yet they did not see it as a priority or obligation. Rather, it was something that one could do if one was interested. So again, a nice power dynamic. I don't really need to do it. If I want to, yeah, sure. And this is why I propose, and working with a colleague, with Professor Jonas Kunst on this as well, we want to introduce a third dimension, which really addresses this power dynamic. And now there's a lot of fancy terms with profound and peripheral separation. It's not so important. It's more important to just realize that power plays an important role when we talk about majority members adapting towards minority members. And maybe to make it a bit more understandable, let's imagine that you can integrate. You can do it with regard to power on two different levels. You can be profoundly integrated, which relates to deep cultural learning. So you really gain a deep understanding. You have the skills, the insight into linguistic and cultural patterns. You have an intuitive understanding of it. That means you're also aware of sensitive, for instance, cultural practices or products. You don't just take, you're aware of the context. Whereas when you're more leaning to the peripheral one, you might have some knowledge of the culture. You might know the etiquettes, you might not have so many cultural faux pas, but it's still rather limited, and we assume you're more likely to tap into the risk of doing cultural appropriation or cultural exploitation, as it's called, because you're not meeting the other culture at an equal power level. You, even unconsciously, might just take things you think, oh, that's interesting and nice, and yet not realizing how much harm you're actually inflicting on the group you take it from. Okay, this is all nice and good, but if I hope I have some minutes left, I tell you what you can actually do with this, practically speaking, because I know SIETAR is all about praxis. So this refers to the project I'm working on with a fantastic group of trainers and volunteers themselves. They're all listed there. You can read their profiles on the project webpage. Our goal with the project is to support charities in motivating and retaining volunteers by providing a training program about understanding and managing refugees as well as volunteers' cultural journey. So that's what we have done so far. We have done multiple trainings, so free trainings for volunteers. We have a free handbook you can all look at, download. It's on the SIETAR webpage, and we also give free webinars to volunteers to continue their journey. If anyone is interested in this, wants to take part and you're in the UK, email me. But what you can do with regard to exercises? One exercise we do is, after introducing volunteers to this concept of strategies, what is integration, everything you have heard about so far, we ask them, now discuss in groups, which of these 4 strategies are you currently following when working with refugees? Is your strategy effective in creating good rapport with refugees you're working with, as well as in supporting their integration to the UK culture? And is your strategy effective in growing as a person whilst working with refugees? Just to give you an example, one of those strategies is based on the integration idea that we show them is combined learning and supporting. So you learn about and participate in elements of refugees or asylum seekers' cultures, as well as exploring the British culture, both together with the refugee or asylum seeker you are supporting. So trying to imply you're not doing this by yourself, you do this in a dual process. Of course, if you want, you can be more specific, separate this into, well, is it more, on a peripheral level? You're a bit engaged, about the do's and don'ts, about communication tasks, but you're not really aware of sensitive topics. You're not really yet embedded in the culture. Just to give you another strategy idea, so this relates to marginalization or diffusion if someone is in high power. We call this individualizing. This is what a lot of people do, which is you say, oh, I don't judge people by their cultural membership. I don't see race, I don't see color. You're a human being and I judge you as an individual being, which is fine and it sometimes works. But there are a lot of limitations, which I will mention in a bit. And that is when you then have a debrief, what I pointed out before, when you talk about a peripheral combined learning and supporting strategy. So this is someone who is starting to tap into integration, but they're still doing this from a superior power level. These are things you could follow up with. These are questions about, well, are you aware of cultural exploitation? Is this maybe something you're doing? How can you avoid doing this? So things like, well, whose cultural product or practices are you using? Is this benefiting you? Are you gaining somehow from it, even if it's just for a laugh? Or is it actually benefiting the group who has or originated this cultural product or practice from? As well as, do you actually support the equal status of this group of origin? With regard to individualizing, if this is something that people follow, fair enough, but make them aware of the potential risks. So the problem with this is that often this is a massively preferred strategy by majority members because we feel good about it. I judge you as a human, I'm such a good person. And there's research on it that says it gives us a good self-image about who we are. We're egalitarian, we're great human beings. However, the problem is that a lot of work, so there's a meta-analysis by Whiteley and Webster, shows it still associates with implicit prejudice. So you might be aware of it, but you're still prejudiced. And the problem is, even if you're low on prejudice, it still predicts opposition to affirmative action to actually make a change in society in favor of minority members. And there's a fantastic summary of this research by Plot from 2018. There's the reference if you want to hear more about this. I may also mention the problem with this is it's massively cognitive taxing. We can't run around and judge people individually and not rely on associations we have learned. We don't have the capacity. You would need to eat a lot of chocolate by the minute in order to have enough energy for doing this. So with this, I'm done. And thank you so much. And I hope I could add some interesting knowledge to this debate and panel.
Thank you so much, Katharina. That was incredibly interesting, and it's leading me to have lots of thoughts and questions. I know questions are coming in from the audience. Those of you who are here, I'm holding those questions till we get to the end. And so I appreciate all of you keep those questions coming in, and we'll hit those at the end. So I'm now going to turn it over to Tariq. So let me unmute.
Unmute, that's a good idea. And so this is the one I want to share. Can you see it clearly, or should I be slideshow?
Just move it. There we go. Move it into slideshow and we're good to go.
Yeah, that's what I was going to do. Well, look, I'll leave it as it is rather than have any more risk. So that's my center, and this is the title, and here's the first slide. So I suggest on this slide 3 different kinds of anti-racism. So the first one, when I say 3 different kinds, that's not very accurate. I should say 3 different dimensions of anti-racism, because they're not competing with each other. They are, as it were, simpler and more elaborate forms of anti-racism. So I'd say that it has 3 dimensions or 3 logical phases. So the first one is anti-discrimination, anti-racial discrimination in relation to laws, policies, and procedures. And I think most people understand that, so I won't go into that anymore. Then anti-racism as de-othering. So this is engagement with and dismantling of stereotypes, discourses, and social processes, trying to dismantle processes of racialization, how groups are made into races, using generalizations about their behavior, usually some kind of attributing inferior practices or less intelligence or criminal behavior and so on. And as that's quite clearly a part of racialization, anti-racism needs to engage with it. And so I'm calling that de-othering. Then the third dimension, which is the one I'll be mainly talking about, is anti-racism, as you can see, as positive identity affirmation. And perhaps here it might just relate to Katharina's talk, to aspects of her talk. And an example of that is turning a negative into a positive. So for most of the history of the term Black, it's been a negative term, a term to describe inferiority, term to describe enslavement and so on. But we saw from the 1960s onwards, especially starting in the United States, African Americans appropriating the term and turning it into a positive term of self-identity, of collective identity. So that's what I mean by positive identity affirmation. Turning to the next slide. So just a word about identity then. I think we need to be aware of 2 different aspects here when we're talking about minorities and racialization and so on. So there's the identity that's given to groups from the outside by other people, by dominant majorities, for instance. And that will be negative. We often describe it as ascriptive because it's stuck on people by others. And it quite clearly involves a form of othering. Again, this relates to some of the things that Katharina has already brought into the discussion. And so in relation to that, I think anti-racism emphasizes the right to resistance, the right to resist negative identity ascriptions onto oneself and one's group, the right to critique that and to dismantle it. And then the next aspect, the other aspect, is the right to struggle for a positive identity. So this is not just trying to overturn a negative image, resist negative projections of one's group, portrayals of one's group, but struggling for a positive identity. And I've got here then, which should have priority. And this then leads me to the point, which is the spine of the talk, the difference between anti-racism and multiculturalism. Because I want to say that on the whole, anti-racism is about the right to resistance, and multiculturalism is about the right to struggle for a positive identity. And therefore, as a multiculturalist, it's what I give greater priority to. So let's talk about positive identity affirmation. This then is the bridge from anti-racism to multiculturalism, the first part, because it's about turning a negative into a positive. Now, I've already very briefly given you an example of that when I said African Americans and following them, other people of African descent, including certainly in Britain, but in other countries too, took the negative concept, the negative identity of Black, and said, actually, we're Black and proud. Black is beautiful. We will accept a Black identity and make it ours and make it worthwhile. So that's what I mean by turning a negative racial identity into, if you like, a positive racial identity. But moving beyond that, and then therefore moving towards multiculturalism, we have the two possibilities under the broken line, where you refuse a racialized identity for an ethnic identity. So you don't say, oh, you think we are an X, we're going to stick to being an X, but we're going to give it a positive identity. You say, we are not the racial group that you think we are our own group. We have an ethnic identity. This could be, we are Pakistanis, we are Somalians, we are Chinese. That's what I mean by refusing a racialized identity for an identity coming from, as it were, the inside out, rather than accepting the outsider identity, but trying to turn that into a positive. And the second possibility here, I mean, there can be a number of other possibilities, but the second one that's very relevant to our times is where people refuse a racialized identity for a religious identity. And of course, as you'll appreciate, the biggest example of that we have, certainly in Western Europe, is the case of Muslims who resist the identities that dominant societies put on them. Certainly in Britain, they can be called Black or Asian or some other racialized identity, and they say, we're not interested in that, and we're not even interested in ethnic identity, like Pakistani or Somalian. Actually, it's our religious identity that is central to our sense of ourselves, and that is what we want to focus on as being equal citizens in a multicultural society. So just to give you a little bit of kind of theoretical background around what this is about then, and this is now, if you like, multiculturalism proper, I'm talking very much about equality as respect or as recognition. And some of you, I'm sure, will recognize that that comes from Charles Taylor's seminal work on multiculturalism as recognition. It emphasizes the importance of self-definition, minorities being able to define themselves and accept it on their own terms. And it recognizes, and this is part of the in multiculturalism, that there are multiple racisms. We can't just see racism in terms of what white people do to Black people meaning people of African descent. There are multiple racisms. There are racisms against people of South Asian origin, racisms against people of Chinese origin, racisms against Muslims that we call Islamophobia. And I won't go into a lot of that because I don't have time, but it is important to recognize that for multiculturalism, unlike some kinds of anti-racism anyway, it's multiple racisms that are critical. At the same time, it's a recognition that there's a multiplicity of identities, and these are fluid. So it's not a matter of static, fixed identities that minorities, say, oh, we are an X, and that's over and done with. Actually, identities are always shifting and moving, and minorities as agents are entitled to change their identities, adapt their identities, hybridize their identities based on borrowing and mixing and so on. So there shouldn't be anything flattening or relativizing about these identities. Each oppressed group should be able to define its oppression, be able to define the racism that it feels that it is subject to. And I don't know whether some of you will instantly recognize that, but this that I have at the bottom of the slide, when this goes back to 1989. In Britain, some people wore badges which said attack racism, not Rushdie. So the Rushdie this is referring to is the author Salman Rushdie of the Satanic Verses. And you will be aware that some Muslims were very angry with that book and with that author. And some anti-racists in Britain, including, white, black, and brown anti-racists, were very dismayed by that Muslim anger. And they said, yeah, don't attack Rushdie, attack racism. That's what that badge was saying. But my point is that that's far too simple. People who experience racism or oppression of that sort of kind should be able to define its oppression, at least in a dialogical way. So it's not like everyone can just say what racism is and that's the end of the matter. They should be able to enter a dialogue about oppression and about multiple racisms. So I'm nearly at the end. I think this is my last slide. So what about equal citizenship then? So this is equality understood as sameness or non-discrimination, but also, and this is very important, that it's not a substitute, it's not an alternative, it's an also equality as respect. Because both of these ideas are based on the idea of citizenship or national citizenship, which is the standard kind, but perhaps not the only kind, and in the future we may have something else. But certainly most of us understand citizenship as forms of national citizenship, and to which minorities want to belong. Because typically, and this also in a way relates to Katharina's presentation, typically minorities want to belong to something bigger than a group, just their group. For example, a national citizenship. And this means the negotiation, the rethinking, or hyphenating of national identities. By hyphenating, I mean things like, being Black British, being German Muslims, and so on. And in the last 2 decades, British identification has become very common with ethnic minorities, even though an earlier generation of anti-racists said that was most unlikely. It's actually proved quite substantially true. And in some respects, I won't go into that, ethnic minorities have a stronger identification with Britishness in Britain than white people do. And so multiculturalism, turning to this back into the middle of the slide, requires the retelling of the national story. This is in quote marks because it was one of the central ideas of a commission that I was part of, and that was referred to in the introduction, the Commission on Multi-Ethnic Britain, where we insisted that anti-racism by itself wasn't enough. It needed to be tied together to ideas of rethinking citizenship and rethinking collectively and dialogically, rethinking national identity. And therefore minorities should be part of a public debate about what it means to be British, and no doubt also French and German and American and so on. And that this is what we meant by retelling the national story. Of course, this has become very prominent in the last year or so, and perhaps SIETAR is very much part of that, because the Black Lives Matter movement has made the historical legacy of slavery and colonialism very much part of its own version of anti-racism. In the longer period, it's been part of multiculturalism. And so I conclude with the idea that public minority identities, not just personal private identities, public identities and categories must be consistent with this equal citizenship and the retelling of the national story when we talk about what it is to be Black British or British Indians. These aren't aberrant and discrepant ideas. They're very much living identities that are being forged and negotiated, sometimes through conflict, very much in front of our eyes at the moment. And maybe I'll stop at that point.
Thank you so much. What powerful words, I think, to me, this idea that you shared around being able to define our own oppression and retelling our national stories is really powerful. So thank you so much for sharing that. And for folks who have questions, please get those into the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll be sure to hit those at the end. I'm going to turn it right over to Peter, who many of you may already know within the SIETAR community, but Peter Musaffariatis has spent over 3 decades working in culture and creative industries. And in 2002, he founded the internationally recognized organization Cultural Infusion, which builds global harmony through intercultural action with education, ICT, and the arts. And in 2019, so just recently, following 5 years of research and development, Peter launched Diversity Atlas, a world-first data analytics tool to be able to provide comprehensive insights into the extent and type of cultural and demographics dimensions of diversity. So we are really excited to hear from you, Peter, today about this relationship of this conversation around anti-racism and the importance of data collection and cultural diversity in supporting anti-racism strategies. So over to you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Tamara, for that warm welcome. And also thanks to Papa and Bale for reaching out to me to participate in today's event. And thanks to the speakers beforehand. You've raised so many important points that I want to weave into this conversation that we're having today. It's almost 4 a.m. here, so good morning from Melbourne, Australia, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you might find. And I think by the end of this conversation, it'll be time for me to get up, because I usually get up around 5:30. It's generally customary in my part of the world to begin any talk with official acknowledgement of our First Nations people. So I want to just recognise any elders that might be in the community, but also as we come here together today, like past and present custodians, I want to also recognise the future custodians of where I come from, and also their respective connection to land, water and communities. Melbourne's been, for more than 50,000 years, has been an important meeting place for First Nations people. Before I begin to respond to the question of my discussion today and the role that data can play in providing a framework for anti-racism action strategies, I want to just maybe spend 3 or 4 minutes just giving you a bit of a background to myself and also to Cultural Infusion. 2 decades ago, I founded Cultural Infusion with the aim of creating cultural harmony through intercultural action. And one of our flagship products, which Tamara mentioned, was our Diversity Atlas, which is now being used by a whole range of organisations across the globe to make the settings that they work in and their organisations more equitable, inclusive and representative through a data-driven approach. Just circling back to where I was born here in Melbourne, most people aren't aware that before Europeans arrived in Australia, there was in the 1700s. There was an estimated 700 languages and speech communities, and a whole lot of dialects that were spoken in this part of the world, and also 324 distinct ethnic groups, or as we would describe today, nation states. I also had a career as a conductor, composer, and creative director, produced countless international productions, including 9 Australia Day concerts. At my final Australia Day concert in 2012, when I was backstage with the most senior Wurundjeri First Nations custodian of the city of Melbourne, I asked Joy Murphy, I said, Joy, how many thousands of people speak your language, the Wurundjeri language? How many thousands? Sadly, she replied, there's only one living person who speaks the language of my people, my auntie. Now, I pose a thought to all of you today. How would you feel if you were the last surviving speaker of a mother tongue? Of the 700 languages and cultures and peoples in Australia, 700 languages that were spoken here in Australia, there's only 15 that are being learned by children. I've often heard this from a lot of my First Nations friends, that the decimation of languages, cultures and peoples in Australia is probably the greatest tragedy of our history. My parents came to Australia in the 1950s, and I put something in the chat there. My mother doesn't speak a word of English. She never went to school, so she doesn't even read and write in her own language. And I'm sad to say that, Australia was born out of racism. Most people aren't aware of that. In 1901, we developed the Immigration Restriction Act, which was later known as the Australian Policy, which became the foundation upon which Australia's allegedly multicultural identity was created. This act basically allowed white Australians to treat anyone else as second-class citizens. Aboriginal people weren't allowed to vote in our country until 1967, and there was a deliberate attempt to try to rid Australia, First Nations people, by concerted efforts to breed Aboriginal blood, out of Aboriginal blooded, blood out of humans. This was actually enshrined in a policy, and the act of confiscating, First Nation children from their families continued right up until the 1970s. And its victims today are known as, the stolen generation. So many of my friends were victims of this inhumane procedure, and the trauma of these attempts to airbrush Australia of Indigenous peoples still has this lasting impact, which continues through so many generations, and so much intergenerational trauma that happens in a lot of these communities. Every wave of migration that has flowed into Australia since 1901 has experienced ethnic and race-based discrimination. Even when I was growing up in the 70s, my real name is Panayotis. We all had to, anglify our names. My name wasn't easy to pronounce, and often our names, if we kept our names, they were often weaponized, against us. Don't even get me started on the name calling. As a conductor and creative director, I found that I had to work so much harder than a lot of my peers in order to achieve successes. There were numerous times throughout the early stages of my career that people would refer to me as here's the Greek conductor, or exclude me from interviews simply because I had a non-Anglo-Saxon name, and they said I wasn't an Australian. I mean, how could this be possible? I have an Australian passport. I was born in this country. Am I not considered part of the status quo? Nevertheless, this drove me to find creative ways to pave a career in the arts. Before I knew it, I was staging major intercultural productions, not only here but across the world. And then I moved into education because I found that events, it wasn't enough to be able to celebrate cultural diversity, bringing people together, but to use education as a way of being able to build intercultural understanding as a core value and key competency of global citizenship. And up until COVID, we were delivering programs to about 350,000 students annually. And the idea was creating these authentic intercultural experiences by taking a range of cultural presenters into schools. If discrimination is driven by fear and ignorance, then the counter drivers become familiarization and collaboration. This is the underlying theme of the work that we've been doing at Cultural Infusion. Racism exists in many forms, and Tariq has been talking about that. You know, there's intercultural racism, there's interpersonal racism, there's this systemic racism all around us. And Tariq talked about racism, you know, as it applies to particular groups. Are we going to solve this problem of racism and discrimination? Of course not. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to probably require some monumental, almost revolutionary and paradigm shift in thinking before we can eliminate ethnic and race-based discrimination. The reality is that all societies resonate with a dimension of history and cultures that allow privileges associated with a hegemony not afforded to others. Racism in the West also threads back to a geopolitical agenda, often connected to advancing neoliberalist ideals and highly individualistic cultures. So as you can see, just from the few minutes I've attempted to describe, you know, through my work, the necessity to use market forces, which is what I've been doing to motivate behavioral change around discrimination and to better understand conceptually the drivers of it. Ignorance, a driver of discrimination, equates to not knowing. Data provides us insights to make informed decisions. Better data on cultural diversity is the first step to be taken in order to ensure that practices, policies, and programs are targeted and designed to close the inclusion and representation gap. The true extent of the opportunity and participation gap, in my opinion, has never been really properly understood because there's no reliable data on inclusion and representation. The pandemic leaking across the world has exacerbated and perpetuated inequality and differences by highlighting, you know, the following. The conflation of race and ethnicity is perpetuating health inequality. The lack of data collection, they're the same. And that we need to take a nuanced approach to data. COVID-19 has highlighted the massive disparity between groups of people and in particular those underrepresented. It has also highlighted the relationship between health and ethnicity. COVID-19 response has often comprised of these blanket approaches that have failed to take into account how socio-cultural factors play a role in the transmission of COVID-19 in our communities. Moving forward, it will become more important than ever to double down on incorporating diversity and inclusion and workplace equity, in addition to ensuring that culturally responsive approaches are being implemented. The leadership programs and policies that keep a clear focus on cultural diversity and inclusion will send, in my opinion, a message of hope. I'd like to now pause and offer a moment's silence for those less fortunate than us during these times. I know many, many people that are being affected by the pandemic. Just a few seconds. Now I want to talk about the role of data and how it can be applied to anti-racism strategies. The European Union's anti-racism action strategy states, accurate and comparable data is essential in enabling policymakers and the public to assess the scale and nature of discrimination suffered and for designing, adapting, monitoring and evaluating policies. This requires disaggregation of data by ethnic or racial origin in order to capture both subjective experiences of discrimination and victimization and structural aspects of racism and discrimination. Now, the European Commission then goes on to say, to be a modern organization, the Commission needs a workforce which is representative of our society as a whole. The laws of 1978 in Europe, in particular in France, which prohibited the collection and processing of personal data, has created a swathe of unintended consequences, namely minority groups and how they've felt completely abandoned. Who are they? How do we find out who these invisible groups are? This has been compounded by a hyper-diversity which can be aptly described as time and space being compressed into ones and zeros, and massive economic globalization without globalization of values and ethics. Europe, as I see it, has a dilemma. It has produced this 27-page action plan against racism, which stresses the importance of the right data to inform policies in reducing ethnic and race-based discrimination. How then does it do this when the GDPR laws prevent the asking of questions that collect data on one's ethnicity and religion? The importance of knowing the other has become more important than ever. It provides insights to drive policies, but on a personal level, the discovery of the other also reinforces the self, builds empathy and bonds which become difficult to break in times of economic instability and the flux that we're finding ourselves in today. In many ways, this is what led to the creation of our transformational analytics tool, Diversity Atlas, 7 years ago. My CTO, Reza Moyini, came to me and mentioned that he could assist with providing metrics to cultural diversity. In no time, we put a team of subject matter experts together from a range of different disciplines and began the process of providing robust understanding to an area which had been poorly defined and analytically neglected: cultural diversity. We disaggregated cultural diversity into 4 main pillars: the participant's country of birth, going back 3 generations, their cultural heritage and how it intersects with geocultures, ancestral heritage, ethnicity, and so forth, languages, speech communities, and dialects, and the 4th pillar being religions and a myriad of branches and denominations. We've compiled this list of 42,000 categories, and it's forever growing. And we intersect these, all these different categories of cultural diversity against age, position type, position level, gender entity, gender expression, sexual orientation, biological sex, and so many other categories. We looked at the metrics of diversity. And what do I mean by that? 3 metrics that we came up with: variety, which we defined as the absence of homogeneity; balance, being the distribution of what we're trying to measure across an organization and its departments; and disparity, or the dissimilarity of what we're trying to measure. So let me just give you an example. In one group, if you had 2 Italian and 2 French people, and in another group, you had Italian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, you have a greater variety of languages there. We can put a metric to that. Then we looked at the balance, which was how that is distributed across an organization. And there's been many studies done here in Australia, which have shown, a recent study by the Human Rights Commission, that 97% of the top 200 companies in Australia were occupied, the leadership positions were occupied by people from Northern European backgrounds. No reflection of the diversity, cultural diversity of Australia. And dissimilarity being, to give you an example, think of that second group, a Portuguese, Italian, French, and Spanish person. Now think of another group being Portuguese, Swahili, Japanese, and Arabic. We know that the distance there is much greater. So one's ethno-linguistic background influences cognitive processes, shapes empathetic responses, and so forth. All these metrics contributed to Diversity Atlas. And for the first 2 metrics, not the last metric, because we need about another 10 years, we developed a whole range of algorithms which allow us to provide a diversity weighting for organizations and departments. It also allows us to look, Diversity Atlas allows us to look at mutuality. And we define this as to what extent are organizations representative of the communities they are delivering services and products to. I can't underestimate the importance of representation or mutuality in reducing ethnic and race-based discrimination. And I've seen this personally in boardrooms and all over the place. You can't be what you can't see. When representation is lacking, the first symptom we see is resentment. I put to you, isn't this the hallmark of a successful democratic society, when it's representative of its people? If it's not, then it's failing. One of the principles of thermodynamics is the law of requisite variety, which states that if a system is not as varied as the environment it's operating in, it will eventually fail. Our societies are becoming increasingly diverse. And simply put, the diversity needs to be reflective and balanced across all levels of organizations and societies. The true extent of the opportunities that come with diversity will never be realized. the true extent of the opportunity and the distance between peoples is yet to be understood because consistent, reliable data is not available. Yes, the answer is better data and is able to inform these sounder policies and programs which will work towards representing all of us. Whilst we may not be in a position to influence change on an institutional level, one thing we can all do is mix with people who are all not like us, to stop living in our bubbles. In the last decade, we have witnessed this meteoric rise of identity politics, the polarization of public discourse, the dehumanization of segments of society, and the breakdown of a vision of inclusivity. By all of us intersecting with others not like us, might just begin to break down barriers and build inseparable bonds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. I appreciate that. I think that to your point, right, that data is a powerful driver for how we find solutions to these really complex problems. So thank you so much. And I think that ties very connects really well with our next presenter, Lynn Mackenzie, who's going to talk about the significance for the enforcement of anti-racial discrimination in legislation. Lynn has had the privilege of working in various sectors, including international human rights law, public policy and advocacy, immigration, and contract and compliance law. And so she's been an advocate for law empowerment and believes that everyone should be engaged or encouraged to actively participate and the legal process that will significantly impact their lives and businesses. So I welcome you, Lynn. Thank you for being here and turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tamara and Papa Bala and our fellow panelists and of course SIETAR Europa for this invitation. I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to share my screen with you now. So thank you again. I'm really happy to be here and to share the importance of enforcing anti-racial discrimination legislation, as I truly believe that it is crucial in racial discrimination elimination. Fundamental rights to be realized. To make a fundamental right a reality, the right must be accompanied with an enforcement mechanism, particularly through the access to justice, which will not only aid in holding violators accountable, but aid in serving as a deterrent. Now, some of you already know what makes a right fundamental in its nature is it's recognized by a high degree of protection from encroachment. These rights are customarily identified in state constitutions, which in turn are adopted within various local legal statutes. Now, I'm going to briefly touch on some applicable international law instruments, the purpose of anti-racial discrimination laws, and of course, the driving force stated in relevant world conferences on the elimination of racism and its promotion of action plans against racial discrimination to fulfill its purpose. Now, also what's vital is why enforcement of the law is important. And there are also some recommendations that have been applied to counter the persistence of racial discrimination. And I'll also touch a little bit on the law empowerment side. So as we all may know, international law instruments are created to administer these various rights, obviously including but not limited to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which proclaims the right of everyone to enjoy all human rights and fundamental freedoms without distinction to race, color, national origin. But more specifically related to the elimination of racial discrimination is the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And this was actually ratified by my own country of South Africa in 1995. And they also have their monitoring body, which is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, that monitors the implementation of rights within state jurisdictions, which are generally adopted through legislation and through policies. Now, these international instruments provide the legal framework, the guidelines, the principles for regional and local jurisdictions to adopt and implement into their laws appropriately. Now, those laws need to ensure that the availability that these laws are available and easily accessible in judicial and or administrative proceedings that provide protection to citizens from violations of these statutes. Now, the very purpose of anti-racial discrimination laws is to provide government strategy, to provide equality, provide remedies, and enforce provisions against incitement and victimization, and provide good practice in all sectors. This was very much emphasized in 2001 at the World Conference Against Racism, which really produced the most authoritative and comprehensive program for combating racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And it was actually held here in South Africa in a city of Durban. And the Durban Declaration and Program of Action was created to establish and implement without delay national policies and action plans to combat racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, including their gender-based manifestations. Now, in 2009, the Durban Review Conference also examined the global interests made in overcoming racism and concluded that remained a lot to be achieved. But the greatest accomplishment was, of course, the renewed international commitment to anti-racism agenda. Now, the National Action Plan against racial discrimination is a very pragmatic approach and quite realistic, actually, and towards the elimination of racial discrimination. And I like it because it recognizes the promotion of racial equality that involves more than just identifying the wrongdoers or adopting the relative legislation prohibiting discrimination, but more importantly, emphasizing the need for enforcement to fulfill its purpose. Now, laws can only be effective if they're enforced, right? Otherwise, the law has no meaning and it has no consequence. So some legal scholars have even said and emphasized that although laws are necessary to prevent criminal actions that specify in most instances the passage to correct those criminal actions must not stop with just enacting of the law, but provide a means of enforcement which is just as important as the law itself. Now, in this case, if you're enforcing anti-racial discrimination legislation and the like, it informs people that the legislation is actually there, that it actually exists, and it educates them to know their responsibilities to each other. It's instrumental in raising and maintaining standards and also preventing abuse. So when it fails, enforcement enables people to be removed from that type of abuse, and it upholds the rule of law by demonstrating that the state, through its judicial administrative proceedings, will be punished. Enforcement also identifies problems and gaps that are within the legislation, therefore will open the door to campaign for further reform. Now, I'm going to share with you just a little local example to illustrate the aforementioned. So in 2018, there was a white woman named Vicky Momberg in South Africa, and she was the very first South African to be imprisoned for racist speech. She used the K word against Black members of the South African Police Department who were trying to assist her after she was robbed. Now, I don't know if everyone is familiar, but the K word is an extremely offensive racial slur that's geared specifically towards people of color here in South Africa. It was extensively used during the apartheid regime, which is the system that institutionalized racial separation and oppression. And I grew up during that time, so I am very familiar and have had firsthand experience of these types of racial epithets. But of course, at that time, there were no consequences or repercussions for it. The incident took place in 2016 and actually was on video. So if anyone is interested, you are able to look it up. She was actually convicted of a crime known as crimen injuria, which under South African common law, and it's defined to be the act of unlawful, intentional, and serious impairing of the dignity of another. Now, this law has been around for a long, long time. However, past violators were not given very stringent sentences. They were given fines, and it didn't serve as a deterrent from violating the statute. Now, of course, there was a lot of criticism for the result of the debate of criminalizing speech, but that's a topic for another day. But of course, many Western democracies like Canada and Britain and France and Germany have laws that carry criminal penalties for speech intended to humiliate or incite against people based on race, religion, sex, or other factors. Now, she did use the K word. She used it 48 times, but that's not the crime. She also, within that video, specified that she would shoot Black people, that she would run them over with her car. So the racist epithet, again, in itself was not the crime, but it translated into racial discrimination by the action of threat and the threat of action that accompanies that epithet, which equates to the violation. Now, South Africa also has the criminalization aspects in our constitution with the freedom of expression. And you have the freedom of expression, but there are also avenues that will not be protected, which is quite common in other jurisdictions and their constitutions, like the advocacy of hatred that is based on race, incitement to cause harm. The section recognizes the harmful effects of racism and invokes race as a category to allow the legislature to pass legislation to protect those individuals against the effect of racial hatred. And this is why and how, without enforcement, the law has no meaning. And people and citizens don't even realize that the law exists till it's enforced, even though this law has been enacted for many years. Now, despite the importance, of course, of enforcement, the persistence of racial discrimination still exists. And so there's some additional proposed solutions that I will share with you now that may aid in that enforcement in the elimination of racial discrimination. Now, Peter talked about data collection, and so I'm going to bring that up as well. But in the context, data collection is needed here to establish a comprehensive criminal justice data collection system on racist crimes in countries that still lack them, so that they have a standardized approach across each state. And this would definitely lead to better informed policy responses in those member states that would enable the criminal justice system to be effective and to tackle racist crime and violence. Law enforcement, given that existing criminal law against racist offenses is not always applied, and therefore victims of racist violence find their access to justice constrained, and certain racist crimes remain unpunished. Definitely police responses to racist crime and violence, because the police act as this justice gatekeeper in the initial reporting and recording of racist offenses, which then determines the eventual investigation and prosecution. Also, having good and accessible reporting and complaint mechanisms are vital. Now, today, discrimination is a little bit more subtle than it was before when I experienced it, systematically during apartheid. But so from a legal perspective, it may be difficult to prove in some instances, but it's not impossible. And as long as you have the right systems in place, you have the right support in place to truly counter the persistence of racial discrimination, enforcement of the legislation is crucial. And again, it's not an easy task, but the continued encouragement of all citizens and states and international support, it can happen, believe me. I have been there, I have seen it, I have seen the law used for oppression, and I have seen the transition to democracy. So it always seems impossible until it's done. But my final thoughts, just reining it in, it's all good to have our laws, it's all good to have implementation, it's all good to have adoption, and enforcement, but you have to bring it home, and to do that, you need to have your citizens to be empowered. It is our duty as citizens to assert our rights, and doing that and doing our own due diligence and understanding the law the best that we can. If you don't recognize violations, you won't have the ability to hold anybody accountable for those violations. And that's why I'm a huge advocate for law empowerment. Active participation in a legal process is significant, and it has a major impact on your lives. Not everybody is as passionate and enthusiastic about the law as I am, but believe me, we are here to help you. We are here to bring the law to light for you. I know it is a scary place. It is dark and technical, but it can be simplified. And believe me, it is something that is incredibly vital in your daily lives. We all spend every day doing some form of legal transaction. And so it will be so much more to your benefit to understand the process. And just final thoughts of law empowerment and its goals. Again, you want to utilize it to protect you, to be able to have opportunities for everybody. It's there to protect people from injustices and exploitation, but also to promote human rights. In that, you can claim your rights, you can shape decisions, you can be a part of policy, and you can also be an agent for your own development. So there have also been some arguments because, usually law empowerment is sort of geared to the marginalized. And that may be true, but it's for everybody. Everybody can have a voice and have an identity. And so some of the counter arguments can be, people can't recognize certain rights, or they don't have access to justice, or they are illiterate, or the law is outdated, the law is complex, it is gray, and that may be true, but I am of the opinion that the law empowerment approach may not be foolproof, but is a good approach, nevertheless, in the right direction, because an educated and enlightened, informed population is one of the surest ways of promoting the health of democracy, as our great leader here in South Africa, Nelson Mandela, has said. So thank you so much for hearing me today on this topic.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for your knowledge and your passion, I think, and it's a very important message around the power of the law, and more importantly, the power when we know how to use the law to protect ourselves and advocate for ourselves and others. So thank you so much. And thank you to those of you who arrived on time and are staying late. We have an incredible panel today, and I want to make sure that we hear from our final panelist, Deepak Ramala, who is the founder and artistic director of the project Fuel. He's a two-time TED speaker. I have listened to his talks yesterday, and a UN action planner. He's a New Age storyteller and artist, and he has done some incredible work with having painted the world's first village of life lessons and developed a methodology that's been recognized as the world's top 100 innovations in education. So I am very excited and happy to hear from Deepak and have him share with us the life lessons that you've learned and how that helps us all in this journey. Over to you, Deepak.
Thank you, Tamara. Namaste, everyone. It is quite a pleasure to meet you, and I'm very, very honored to be on such an esteemed panel. Listening to all of you and your incredible work does, help a young person like me feel a little bit more secure in a racially divided world, particularly now as, we become more polarized and in many ways, get confronted with the realities of racial injustice or discrimination and inequality in the face of COVID-19. I live in India, and I've had the honor of traveling across the world and working with several communities. And in 2016, I had the opportunity to travel across Europe and work with refugees who were primarily displaced by the conflict in Syria. And alongside this 90-day tour that focused around using the wisdom of the refugees to integrate them in their new homes and in their new places, there was a lot of conversation and a lot of understanding that I had from an on-ground perspective that I wish to share. A lot of my previous panelists and speakers have covered some important things about law in terms of multiculturalism. When it comes to stories and it comes to experiences of common people, there are several challenges that we see. As an educator and an artist, I see them in a very different light, but with the same essence. I'm just going to share my screen with you all and show you some of the pictures from on ground. All right. So during this entire tour, as I traveled across 5 countries of Europe, lived in the refugee camps, and worked through the integration of the refugees, not just from Syria, but Eritrea, Afghanistan, Pakistan, South Sudan, I realized that a lot of conversation about race integration, or just in terms of mobilization of people's mentality towards acceptance and integration of these refugees from different cultural contexts, subsided with the lens provided by adults. Everywhere I went, I read policy papers, and I read news interviews, and I read a lot of opinions and well-articulated responses, but mostly by adults. And that's what I want to bring into the discussion today. Where do we fit in the younger voices that are marginalized because we feel, oh my God, they're not ready enough, they're not experienced enough, they're not scholarly enough to be brought into the discussion about racial justice and about racial integration. In all of this tour, a lot of times I met individuals who had very hardcore beliefs and were refugee hating to the point that race was a red flag to them to even have a conversation and ask the name of the person. And as I moved through the tour, I shifted my approach that I would first want to work with a school in one of the European countries like Sweden or Netherlands, Germany, France, and Hungary, and see what the kids had to say. In one such school in Sweden, which was my first country off the tour, I remember walking to a school and saying I would like to do a session. They had seen some of my work, as Tamara was mentioning, some of the TED Talks. When I arrived on the day of the workshop, I told them my entire session focused on life lessons of refugees and the story of refugees. And the school was pretty, I would say, confronted with the reality of that, because they had said yes to me. I was now in their premises. And they were shocked that I would be speaking to the children about the refugees who were in the age group of 8 to 12. In fact, I was advised by one of the school coordinators that the kids have no knowledge about refugees or race. I said, but on my way to your school, I saw them, on the streets, just outside the schools. How can the kids not see them? So anyways, the discussion led to a fruitful association of them granting me 25 minutes to have a conversation about race and refugees. And if the kids did not feel traumatized, is the word the person used, I could continue. Well, I would like to not just show you some of the work, but also tell you that the 25-minute discussion with the children extended to a 4-hour session. And I told them stories of all the refugees I had met in Sweden at the train stations, outside their schools, the conversation I'd had over the past few weeks. And at the end of the session, I asked them to write a letter to a refugee whose story they most resonated with. And here are some of the letters that I want to show you. One kid named Spencer Peterson writes that, "Dear refugee, I want to welcome you. We love and accept you for who you are. Here, there is hope and many possibilities." That's a 12-year-old child whose life lesson is no matter where, even in the darkest cave, there is hope. There's another child named Nicole. She said, "Never lose hope and stay strong. The most amazing things always happen when you least expect them. You must have what I will never understand, but I do know one thing, it always gets better." That's a 13-year-old person's advice to one of the biggest humanitarian crises that we saw. This is one of the other letters. There were 60. I'm not going to show you all. This is the last one from the thread. And it says, I have learned that lives are like roller coasters, sometimes good, sometimes bad. All you have to do is, till when you're on the sad part, you have to wait until you get to the high part. The reason I show you these references as examples is primarily to bring attention that racial conversations cannot happen in isolation. They cannot happen in the adult world. We have to bring them to the level because these children are going to grow up to be the torchbearers of the work that Mr. Peter or Professor Tariq or Dr. Katharina or Lynn have done. These are the people who have to be made to feel included from the get-go about what are the challenges and how to perceive them. The second important part that comes in involving children into these conversations from a very early stage is to create some sort of racial identity development. We often talk about racial socialization, and we forget that the precursor to racial socialization is racial identity development, which means that the individual self-concept or how they feel about themselves in relation to a group's membership or their perceptions of that membership have to be defined before you can ask them to integrate or champion the cause of that particular race. I have been in communities and in areas around the world where children do not fully understand their own response, their own bias, and their own judgment of how they see certain things in their race dominating in the global scenario. And if we are able to take that individual comfort and discomfort into the conversation, we might be able to better understand how to socialize this person. There are many ways we can attempt to do this. I think grandparents are positioned in a very beautiful way to do this, because there is a lot of relationship understanding. There is a bond. There is also time that grandparents have on their hands that parents may or may not have in our busy schedules of the 21st century. The second most important thing is that we always see grandparents as not just storytellers, but as survivors and beautiful champions of racial justice that has helped them prevail for so many years in a world that they're just starting to confront. If you get bullied on the school playground and you come home and have a conversation with your 70 or 80-year-old grandmother, you will be able to see that she was able to employ certain tools, certain techniques, and certain response mechanisms that helped her stand at the grocery line and not feel reduced by the perception of the person who stood in front of her or behind her. And so what I'm bringing to a lot of empirical and research and scholarly insights that were presented before me is this humane, on-ground, tangible approach to a lot of insights and data that has been beautifully captured by the previous panelists. I want to add on to that the solutions are all around us, but need to be seen in the light of the communication, the dialogue that we have, not just with children, but overall in our relationships with each other. I'm going to quickly show again my PowerPoint slide and show you some pictures. I love to talk about children as collaborators and not just beneficiaries of our work. I think we have treated them as vessels to be filled with information, and primarily empty vessels to be filled with information. But if we see them as collaborators, we'll be able to acknowledge, even in our education system, that it is not that we need to make our children more knowledgeable, more intellectual, but that we need to make them more wise. And this is a tricky subject, right? How do you make someone wise? Well, you make someone wise through understanding what wisdom stands for. It's been a topic that has been far longer discussed in philosophy and in religion throughout history. But in the last 50 years, scientists and scholars have started to investigate what does it mean to make someone wiser. And in that relationship, we've understood that wisdom is a complex social construct, and it has these varied components. Some of those components are very easy to identify: pro-social attitudes and behavior, where we are encouraged to think for the common good. It is also about perspective taking. And when we create room to listen to somebody else's opinion, which might differ from ours, we're able to create room for that individualistic identity, which is not in threat to our identity. And that is where I think the shift will happen from us fighting each other to us negotiating with each other for our voices to be heard. And I think this one way or the other often leads to marginalization, it leads to segregation, it leads to the inferiority complex, but somewhere negotiation, listening to each other's wisdom creates more room and appreciation. And I have been collecting life lessons for 13 years. I started teaching at the age of 17. And you will be surprised, I am yet to meet one individual who hasn't shared something valuable for me. And that's where I come to the part of value relativism and tolerance. When you see people and you value them in racial or in equality context or in non-discriminatory context, we often see people in relation to the value they can provide to us. And the problem with that is we don't really assign that value to everybody. We see people with power and money and certain influence having the right and the privilege to receive our respect and our love. Wisdom is a beautiful way of addressing every single person, whether it's a woman from the Maasai tribe in Tanzania, whether it's a young girl in Afghanistan, whether it's a sex worker in Nepal. All of these people have something worth sharing. And when you create room for that, you're able to understand, let me at least honor this person the chance to share their story and how they have come to the condensation of their learnings. The picture that you see on your screen is a social experiment that I designed on my refugee tour for people who hated refugees. And I was interviewing a refugee in one of the most volatile refugee camps called Calais in the south of France. And he said to me, Deepak, the only way you can integrate us in this system is by understanding that a resource means nothing if you don't have the accessibility to use it. I thought a lot about it. And when I was invited to teach people who were working with refugees or refugee hating groups, I invented a little game. I brought balloons with me, deflated balloons with me, and I placed them in front of every single person participating in the room. I asked them to blow the balloon, but there were two rules. You couldn't touch the balloon, and you couldn't, you couldn't touch it, you couldn't blow it. You couldn't use your hands and mouth in simple ways to blow the balloon. Now imagine that in a scenario, you have a balloon in front of you, you cannot touch it, you cannot blow, use your mouth or your hands. How will you blow it? Some of the smartest people I met in France and across the tour spent 5 minutes trying to decipher how are they going to blow a balloon without touching it. When they started to feel frustrated, I told them, I'm going to dissolve rule 1, which is you can use your hands, but you still cannot use your mouth. Everybody, human psychology, right? Everybody was very thrilled. They picked up the balloon, put it up their nostrils, and they tried to blow it through their nose. Of course, they created a lot of mess. And after 10 minutes, when they were further frustrated and giving up, I dissolved rule 2 as well, that they could use their mouth. And this picture that you see is 10 seconds after I dissolved the rule. It took literally 10 seconds for everybody in the room to blow a balloon, tie a knot, and start playing with it around. And this is where I brought in the perspective of the refugee that I mentioned to you. A resource, which probably in this case is a balloon, simplest thing on the planet to do, blow a balloon, can be the hardest thing to achieve if you don't have the accessibility to do it. And I think when we talk about racial justice, when we talk about integration and assimilation, we have to ask ourselves, how much access do these people have to have the resources that we have spoken about that they can use and leverage for their racial integration? These examples that I see partake around the world with communities is also stemming from the fact that racial conversations, especially from the West, are a lot of times in the developing world ruled by the Masiha attitude, the savior syndrome, as we call it. It is, that first of all, this divide was created to make us feel inferior. And now everything is being done by the people who created it in somewhat in the first place to save it. We are still borderline in the conversations. This is the Maasai tribe in Tanzania that I spent nearly 5 years working with, and I have a beautiful association. And a lot of times when people do come to make them feel a little more, incentivized or somewhat supported with their volunteer or charity work, what often interrupts that philanthropy is the Masiha attitude. We are here to save you. The reference and the reverence for what already exists is so little that a lot of times the conversations that I've had with the community is that the person listening to them doesn't really want to pay attention to the nuances that shape their lives, the little cultural anecdotes, the jokes, they all are part of racial justice. Because if you're going to crack a joke and nobody laughs at it, you're going to feel pretty isolated in a social setting. Questions such as, language, power, popularity, aspirations have been condensed and labeled with the lens of this identity. Now, I shared a lot about wisdom and how, I use it in my work. I want to quickly share with you why it matters to me and how I learned about it in the next 2-3 minutes as I wrap. My mother was pulled out of school when she was in grade 5 by her grandmother and never had a chance to go back to school. When I was growing up, my mother told me that story and encouraged me to study better because I had opportunity and resources. I thought that's a fake story. I thought my mother was using what in reality shows people use as a stop story to get more votes. And my mother told, when I asked her, how did she learn so much? She said, life is my classroom. I'm learning from living. And to my 14-year-old brain, that meant if she is learning simply by living, that means everyone who's living is learning something. And where can we find that information and how can we use it to better understand? That's why I collect life lessons of people from around the world since the age of 14 and teach them. Because I see that allowing people's value to come out of the experiences they have had and to be able to bring their own respect and their own associations with it would have such a far-reaching impact in the world that we live in. Last 2 things that I want to mention is that we also have to understand race in the context of language. We still have, in many parts of the world, words that have racial context being used. For example, we say master bedroom. We say, let's blacklist this person. Let's whitelist this person. These are so deep rooted into the ideologies, into the vocabulary, into the lexicon, and finally into the behavior of people growing up, that I think when you study race as just as a definition or as a social problem to solve, you don't see yourself as a part of it. You think, I'm good to everybody. What am I doing? I'm not really part of the problem. This is a West problem in that sense. As Professor Tariq was saying, a black and white problem, or an Asian and a British problem in that context. But here, even in India, when you start to see that children are being taught and trained in slurs that have been so demeaning and debilitating for people growing up, I think we will be able to build bridges, because language is the first introduction to culture. That's what a child or anybody learns to express themselves. And so when I receive an Excel sheet in my office, somebody saying the master plan, I take a moment to say, let's shift it to a main plan or a final plan. And having to take that moment in the middle of a work discussion to say why the word master is not the appropriate one in this context. I think those are the small, tangible efforts we can take to take all this beautiful research work and implement it on ground. And the last thing that I wish to share with all of you is that in many ways, what we have to learn is to understand that the conversation of race and multiculturalism can also happen in the celebration of that culture itself, not just in the contrast to another culture. My example for that is Toni Morrison was asked throughout her career by white journalists, when is she going to start writing about the main conflict that threatens Black lives, which is the white conversation? And she never wrote about it. And she was asked constantly, when is she going to come at the main topic? We have to start to understand that what we call marginalized is only a subjective view of our understanding. It is where we stand. And the world doesn't rotate around us. It rotates about everybody who's in the world. And if you're able to change your stance, if you're able to culminate your perspective, you might be able to celebrate people's stories for who they are, where they come from, and realize that they matter by default, whether or not your story highlights, emphasizes, or in any ways criticizes their work. People still live. And I would like to end with a beautiful life lesson of a philosopher, photographer, friend of mine named Lisa Christine shared. She is a photographer, humanitarian photographer who documents modern day slavery and has traveled across 110 countries. When I met her at the United Nations for my panel, I asked Lisa, who has traveled, so many places in the world, I said, what did it teach you? And she said, there are 1,000 ways to be alive. And you have no right in the world to think only your way is the right one. So I hope that, as we build these conversations, we can realize there are 1,000 ways to be alive and maybe more when we come to discover them. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Deepak. What a wonderful way to end our conversation today that really puts a fine point on the discussion that everybody has shared, the incredible research and practice and processes that help us move all of our communities and cultures forward in enhancing equality and really challenging discrimination and racism and other forms of oppression. And if we can all find that value in other people and recognize that there are 1,000 ways to live and use that in all the ways that we can integrate and build community and have these conversations, I am very hopeful for where we move forward as practitioners in the field, as researchers in the field, and as human beings within our communities to move forward. So thank you to all of the panelists for your incredible contributions and the time you gave today. Once again, I want to thank Papa Bala for his incredible leadership in bringing you all together, and to our incredible attendees who have stayed with us from beginning to end. If there are any questions that have not been answered, please feel free to post that in the chat. Otherwise, this recording will be available on our YouTube channel, so all our panelists can share this with their networks and communities. And we were happy to have you all here, and we wish everybody else a wonderful evening, morning, or afternoon, depending upon where in the world you are currently sitting. Thank you, everyone.